Okay, this week we are going to be talking about federal regulations and policy making, essentially the role that the federal government plays in trying to make sure that the media is open and free and competitive and relatively available to all Americans. Um, so let's jump right in to ownership in the media. We're going to go back to 1890 to start out. The Sherman Antitrust Act, one of the earliest laws aimed at protecting competition in the United States. And while initially this obviously wasn't focused on media, which doesn't look anything like it, did in 1890, this really the core of the law was to prevent monopolies, whether we're talking about railroads or other industry. They wanted to ensure free trade, and the idea was pretty simple: competition is good for all of us. If you are going to buy a car and there are seven companies that sell cars, they're going to compete with each other. They're going to have to fight for your business. They might lower prices. They might run promotions. They're going to have to give good customer service. But if we only had one company that sold every car in America and we all had to buy it from them, the company would have no incentive to be innovative, to be cost conscious, to provide good service, because you'd have no alternative. If you wanted a car, you'd have to go to them. So that's the idea. Sherman Antitrust Act said competition is good, open market is good, and that's kind of the goal of that. So as it applies to media industries, it's incredibly important because we're going to see examples where if you have a small number of companies that are sort of dominating in the media landscape, they can control the message that's delivered. They can control how and when consumers get information, and it can lead to the potential for a lot of manipulation of the media. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, in theory, sort of is a check and balance that keeps that in place rather. A couple of things that we want to talk about within media ownership is the concept of vertical or horizontal integration, which are just two ways that sort of media industries can structure what they do. So, if we look at vertical integration, it's when a company with the same owner or same leadership handle different aspects of a business within the same industry. So, a good example here would be Disney. Right? Disney obviously makes very successful movies, but that's just one element of what they do. When we talk about vertical, meaning they grow upward, they not only create their movies, they distribute their movies, they own their own streaming platforms like Disney Plus. They own their own theme parks, and within those theme parks, what do? They dominantly promote their movies. They own lines of products, sweatshirts and stuffed animals and keychains and everything you can imagine to, again, promote their movies. So that's a vertical integration. It's where they've got layer upon layer building up within different aspects within the same industry. So they're not just stopping with the movies, they're handling every element vertically to grow. The alternative, or the other side of that we're going to talk about, is horizontal integration, and that's more when we're looking at ownership that are all in the same business. So it could be a merger, it could be a company buys another company, they could merge with another company that are doing the same type of thing. So let's look here in Buffalo. When one media corporation owns multiple TV networks or radio stations competing in the same space, that would be horizontal integration. So here in Buffalo, if the people that own Channel 2 also owned the Buffalo News, or they also owned radio station WBEN, that would be horizontal integration. Now, in both of these forms, vertical and horizontal, there's an absolute benefit, right? It can make things run more efficiently, and that can be a good thing. A lot of times in local media, it can be very hard to be profitable. And suddenly, if you've got resources pooling together from three or four media outlets, you may have more advertising revenue that may allow you to hire more reporters and do more investigative journalism. So there could absolutely be a positive to come out of that. However, the flip side is that it raises serious concerns about the potential for a lack of competition and a lack of diversity in the information that is being put forth, right? So that obviously could be a problem if you're in Buffalo and all or a majority of the media outlets are owned by one company. They're going to control the messaging that comes across to the public, and that can easily be manipulated, right? We've seen that come through with election coverage, policy reform, just all kinds of ways that can be harmful. Um, okay, let's look a little bit at the 1996 Telecommunications Act. So, 1996, President Clinton is in office. The internet is becoming it's kind of in its not infancy, but it's in its very early stages where it's pretty clear this is going to become a huge thing. And at the time, it was incredibly hard to own any kind of media, a piece of the media. There was just a massive amount of federal regulations that you had to go through, and it was really, really hard. So part of the thought, really the primary intent of the Telecommunications Act, although there were layers and layers to it, but the primary goal was to increase competition. They wanted to open it up and make it more readily available for people to come in and compete. They thought that would be better for the consumer in the end, and it would create all kinds of innovation and really drive great change. It One of the things it did was limited limits on the number of stations a company could own, and we're going to see in our work this week a company called Sinclair Broadcasting and why maybe that's not a good thing. It raised the proportion of the nation that could be covered by a network stations. So again, it used to be they tried to limit it so that you couldn't have so much reach that you could, excuse me, influence, a majority of the country. They tried to limit how much reach one company could have in terms of its audience. Following the 1996 Act in 2001, the FCC also lifted its ban on one company owning more than one broadcast TV network. And then you see there the difference with radio, no national limits, and the ownership caps increased with market size. So again, the goal of all of this was competition is good and we want more of it. Unfortunately, when it comes to the 1996 Telecommunications Act, it really completely backfired. It in practice was supposed to do that, but what it really did was it triggered massive consolidation because companies were now allowed to own more than one outlet. Those who had money just started swallowing up smaller news and media outlets, and before you know it, we were left with what we have today, which is just giant conglomerates that own, whether it's Tenga is one here in Buffalo that owns Channel 2. They own TV stations across the country. Sinclair, which I mentioned, and you're going to be watching a video about this week, massive owner of huge numbers of media outlets. And so, although the intent was good with the act, in reality, it actually massively shrunk competition, and many people believe did more harm than it did good. Let's look at cross ownership. So, cross ownership happens when one company owns different types of media within the same market. It could be in Buffalo. If one company were to own the Buffalo News and they were own Channel 2 and they were to own WBEN, which is our local radio station, that's cross ownership. And it raises a really important question I want you to think about. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this question. It's kind of a philosophical question, but should one company control multiple sources of news in a single community? Again, as I mentioned before, that could be a good thing if it gives them more resources, allows them to do more in depth reporting or have more access to things. There could be good to it. The flip side, again, it could, if you're allowing one company to control a lot of the information, it's sort of could be used in a manipulative way or in a way that is not in the best interest of the consumer. So again, it's not necessarily a right or wrong, but it certainly is something to think about, as we talk more about this. In 2008, the FCC issued new rules that allowed limited TV newspaper cross ownership, but only when the TV station was not dominant in its market. So they basically said, okay, especially this is true in a big city where there's a lot of, a diverse number of television stations. Okay, so if you do not have the dominant station in your market, the FCC said, well, there'll be some limited opportunities to have that cross ownership. But generally, it's regulated pretty heavily, again, with the end game always being fairness for the consumer. Let's talk a little bit about net neutrality. This is something you may have heard about. It's been debated, quite honestly, almost since the beginnings of the internet. But neutrality, at its base level, it's a requirement that internet providers treat all of the data that passes through their networks on an equal basis, basically preventing them from favoring their own content or really favoring anybody's content. And so what that basically means, and you probably know this from your cell phone contracts or how your phone works. They'll talk about you can speed up the network and you can slow down the network, and things can be prioritized over other things in terms of the speed of which your accessibility is. And so net neutrality basically says it's got to be neutral, that all the data that passes through is treated on an equal basis without any favoritism to who it's coming from or what it is. And the idea is, again, always everything we're talking about this week is talking about making it fair for the consumer, for the public, so that they're not, there's no undue influence in a negative way on the consumer. This is hugely debated in political circles. It's been, there's been legal fights for decades at this point. Broadly speaking, and there's exceptions, but broadly speaking, Democrats generally favor net neutrality. They want laws in place that are going to ensure that all data that passes through, there's no bias to it, and it's all put out there equally. Republicans, again, broadly speaking, they want to roll back. What they're seeing is basically restrictions on open business practices. They want, their idea is that, listen, if you have net neutrality, it's going to stifle investment. There's going to be less incentive for companies to invest in whether it's the infrastructure on the internet or any of the other elements of it. That is basically bad business practices. So again, lots of debate there. It's ongoing. There are lawsuits. There's challenges all over the place. Congress at one point did attempt and is still attempting to pass legislation initially supporting net neutrality, didn't gain enough support. In 2018, California really is the most successful example of a state that said, we're going to pass our own net neutrality act. Very strong language, was almost immediately challenged by the United States Department of Justice. As of today, 2026, they have not been successful in that legal challenge, but there are still ongoing challenges of that. But I will say this, one of the challenges that went down was a challenge to say the FCC can't stop states from making their own net neutrality laws, which initially they did want to say, listen, this is a federal issue. It's not for the states. And a lower court did determine, no, states are allowed to do that. And so today there is pending legislation in various stages of development in states across the country, Alaska, Georgia, Minnesota, Mississippi, New York State, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa. I mean, just states all over the country have varying levels of this. But again, California being the one that has implemented it at the strongest level. So net neutrality, I would certainly argue, is a good thing. Don't we want all of our information to be distributed equally and without bias to everybody? But again, just depends which side of that you're on. There is a phrase that's used to kind of describe this, and I might be getting it slightly wrong, but I think it's called the blind pipe theory. And what it basically means is that under our city, whatever city you're in right now, there are water pipes, and the water pipes are blind. They deliver water equal speed, equal quality, equal water pressure to every home and business regardless. They don't know who lives in the house. They don't know what the business does. They just blindly, everybody gets the same water regardless of any other factors. And so that's kind of a good parallel to how net neutrality would work, that it shouldn't matter who's getting the information or who's sending the information, that it should all come out equally. Okay, so that's kind of just a way to think of that in a practical sense. Now, another question I want you to consider when we talk about diversity of ownership. So we say now there are examples where companies can own lots of TV stations, or in some cases, they can own a TV station and a newspaper. And the argument is, no, we need more diversity of ownership. But the question that I want you to think of is, does diversity of ownership guarantee diversity of content? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about that as you do some of your reading and as you watch the video this week about Sinclair Broadcasting. Does diversity of ownership guarantee that you're going to have diversity of content? Now, let's talk a little bit about universal access to service. Again, pretty heavily debated for a number of years in our country, but the general principle, everyone should have basic access to telecommunications services. We have a huge digital divide in this country, believe it or not. It might seem crazy where we are to say that there are people that don't have access to things, but you'd be amazed at the number of rural areas where they don't have necessarily free and clean and easy competitive access to high speed internet, for example. Whether it's rural areas, low income areas, minority areas, neighborhoods, homes, they are less likely to have access to specifically to high speed internet access than urban high income areas. The US, again, also lags behind many industrial nations in broadband access, and it has gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot better in recent years. So initially, the FCC had set a goal of having broadband in 90% of US homes by 2020. By most measurable accounts, they did not meet that goal. It was still pretty far behind. But by now, by 2026, the FCC says 95% of all homes and businesses in the United States have access to broadband services. Now, that sounds great, and it is great, but even 5% of homes not having access is still tremendous number of people who don't have access to a very basic form of accessing the media. So something that is, again, can be kind of concerning. Let's talk a little bit about owning across the spectrum. The Communication Act of 1934 established the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. We hear a lot about the FCC. We heard a lot about them during the Super Bowl, particularly with challenges to the halftime show. But the FCC also has a huge and powerful and influential role. They make the rules for awarding and renewing licenses. So when we talk about you have to have a license to own a TV station or radio station, and those are given out by the FCC and they are renewed by the FCC. So you may remember last year, Jimmy Kimmel's talk show. There was a lot of talk about the FCC and a push for them to go all the way to revoking their license based on content that was being aired on the Jimmy Kimmel's late night show. So again, they are enormously influential and powerful when it comes to deciding who gets to have a license to even operate in this media. And again, the main criteria set forth is generally, is it in the public interest, right? Does more media and does the different types of media and do the specific stations, is it in the public interest for them to exist? All right, so I want you to think about all of that as well, especially again today. There's so much controversy about the FCC, whether they are fining stations, whether they are threatening stations to pull them off the air for content they disagree with, all kinds of things, like that. Let's look a little bit about radium spectrum frequencies, defined by the International Telecommunications Union. Again, this is more background. I don't need you to know a ton about this, but I just want you to be aware of kind of how it works. Again, to get a radio frequency, those are defined and controlled by those groups as well. They allocate frequencies to different countries, of which then within the country, your government allocates them internally. So you can't just go out and start a radio station, have a frequency and get going. There's all kinds of federal bureaucracy, again, intended to make sure that things are fair and equitable and that the consumer is protected. But we know that's not always quite the case. Now, let's talk a little bit about policymaking. Within the executive branch, right, we've got several groups that are in charge of policymaking when it comes to the media. The first, as we talked about, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They regulate almost all aspects of communication, whether it's issuing those licenses, whether it's enforcing violations of the various rules. They're heavily into fining stations that violate, their various rules and things like that. They handle all the complaints that come through the public. So when people see something objectionable on TV or in the media, they will file complaints through the FCC, which is in charge of investigating those and making determinations as well. Then we've got the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, big mouthful. And that covers, again, some aspects of policy, research, international policy as well. Again, you don't need to know a ton about that. Just want you to be aware of the existence. And then another big one is the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. Now, specifically, kind of the uniqueness that differentiates them from the FCC is that the Federal Trade Commission is in charge of monitoring trade and business practices. So a good example here would be if there was a business that was running ads on television that were potentially conveying false information, inaccurate information, and then complaints would be handled by the Federal Trade Commission, and they are in charge of monitoring what's being put out there. Is it accurate? Does it meet the law requirements, ethics, guidelines, all of that, and handling things accordingly? And again, similar to as we talked about early on in the first couple weeks of class, sort of the dividing of the different roles of government, Congress is going to pass the laws about communication. And then the court system, of course, is required to interpret those laws. And when we talk about some of the different lawsuits that are going on with net neutrality and things like that, again, Congress has the laws that they have, but it's the courts that are going to interpret whether these are legal or how they're going to be enforced and that sort of thing. So policymaking is ongoing. Ideally, again, it is all driven with the consumer in mind and really wanting to make sure that the government can minimize the amount of too much control being in the hands of small groups of businesses, companies, people, and that there's enough check and balance in place so that the consumer, number one, has access to the media, number two, has access to a diverse voice in the media, and then what's being put out there follows the many, many, many federal laws that are in existence. So that's how it's all supposed to work. I want you to particularly think about this as you watch the John Oliver video and you write your paper on that. I want you to think a lot about how the Sinclair broadcasting model fits into all of this that we've talked about in this lecture. And for good, for bad, for otherwise, I want you to kind of think about that and how it all ties into this main message of today's lecture. So again, as always, before you move on, if you have questions, if there's something you didn't understand, take some notes, either watch the lecture again, do some additional research on your own. That's important. And if you're still not sure, always please reach out to me. Anything we talked about can expect it to be in a quiz or an exam. In fact, some of it will be. It's also going to be part of what you're doing with your upcoming paper this week as well. So again, really take the time to make sure that this all makes sense to you. And if you're struggling with any part of it, please do reach out to me. Other than that, it's a big week for you this week. We've got you got the paper with the Oliver video, and also it's your final exam this week as we head into wrapping up this quick 7.5-week semester. So thanks for hanging in there with this video, and good luck with your work this week. Please reach out if I can be of any assistance.